The city of New York pulsed with its usual chaotic rhythm, blaring horns, rushing footsteps, and the low hum of distant conversations that spilled from every street corner. It was early evening, and the neon lights of Times Square flickered like artificial stars against the encroaching night. Among the throng of hurried commuters and wide-eyed tourists, a voice broke through the cacophony, clear, pure, and sincere. Emily Hawthorne paused mid-step, her stiletto heels clicking softly on the pavement. She turned her head, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. Beside her, Jack Hawthorne, her husband, tightened his grip on her arm. "Emily, we're going to be late," Jack muttered, glancing at his Rolex. His voice carried the same polished impatience that defined his every move. Emily ignored him, her gaze sweeping the crowded sidewalk until she saw the boy. He couldn't have been more than 10 years old. He stood on the corner near a street performer's usual haunt, a small boy dwarfed by the weight of the city. His clothes were old, his sneakers scuffed and mismatched, but his eyes shone with an earnest light that seemed to defy the world around him. The boy held a toy microphone, battered and cracked, as though it had survived a dozen childhood adventures. Yet when he sang, the imperfections of the plastic seemed to disappear. His voice soared, untrained but filled with an unshakable joy. The melody wasn't just a song, it was a defiance of everything cold and harsh in the world. "Jack, listen," Emily said softly, tugging her arm free from his grasp. Jack glanced at the boy, his gaze flicking over him without pause. "It's just some kid," he said dismissively. "People do this all the time. He's probably hoping for a few bucks." Emily's lips pressed into a thin line, her brow furrowing. "It's more than that. Look at him, Jack. Really look at him." Jack's expression hardened. He pulled his phone from his pocket, his thumb scrolling through emails. "Emily, we have to go. This gala is critical. You know what's riding on tonight." But Emily didn't move. Her eyes remained on the boy, whose voice seemed to weave itself into her very soul. For a moment, the honking cars and bustling crowds faded into the background. All she could hear was his song. There was something achingly familiar in the way he sang, as if he were baring his entire heart to anyone who cared enough to stop and listen. The boy, his name was Ethan Morales, as she would later learn, caught her gaze and smiled. It wasn't the guarded, performative smile of someone expecting a tip. It was open, warm, and unshakably sincere. It was the kind of smile Emily hadn't seen in years. Her chest tightened as memories she had buried long ago rose to the surface. The people walking past Ethan barely glanced at him, their hurried steps and distracted gazes brushing him off like he was invisible. Emily noticed the jar at his feet, containing a meager handful of coins and crumpled dollar bills. It was unfair. A voice like his, a spirit like his, should have commanded a stage, not a cracked pavement corner. She stepped closer, feeling Jack's exasperated sigh behind her. "Emily, I mean it, let's go." But she couldn't tear herself away. As she moved closer, she noticed more details. Ethan's clothes were patched in places where they had torn. His sneakers were so worn she could see the faint outline of his toes through the material. Yet he stood tall, undeterred, his voice unwavering. He sang as if the world deserved to hear him, even if the world refused to stop. "Why do you sing out here?" Emily asked when he paused for breath. Her voice was soft, almost hesitant, as if she were afraid of breaking whatever magic surrounded him. Ethan looked up at her, his brown eyes wide with curiosity. "Because it makes people happy," he said simply. "And it makes me happy too." Her heart clenched at the simplicity of his answer. Before she could respond, a new voice broke through the moment. "Ethan." The voice was strong but weary, tinged with both relief and frustration. Emily turned to see a woman approaching quickly. She was small, her frame thin but sturdy, with dark curls pulled into a messy bun. Her clothes were simple, a worn jacket and jeans, but her face was striking, her eyes sharp with determination. Ethan lit up at the sight of her. "Mama," he called, running toward her. The woman, Lila Morales, pulled Ethan into a tight hug. She murmured something to him, her words lost in the din of the street. Then she straightened, her eyes meeting Emily's. There was a flicker of suspicion there, quickly replaced by gratitude when she saw Emily's kind expression. "Thank you," Lila said, her voice firm but warm, "for listening to him." Emily hesitated. "He's remarkable," she said. "Does he sing here often?" Lila nodded, her smile faint. "When I'm working late, He sings near where I can keep an eye on him. He says it's his way of helping out. Emily's stomach twisted. Helping out? Shouldn't he be in school? Playing? Lila finished, her tone not unkind. He does all that too. But times are tough. We do what we have to. Jack finally stepped forward, his frustration bubbling over. Emily, we really need to go. He nodded curtly at Lila. It's nice that you're here. But we're late for an event. Emily turned to him, her expression unreadable. Jack, just give me a minute. His jaw tightened. This isn't us. Emily, this isn't what we do. She looked back at Lila and Ethan. The boy had resumed singing, his small voice cutting through the night air like a beacon. Emily felt something stir deep within her, a yearning, a restlessness that had been dormant for too long. This, Emily said softly, almost to herself, feels more important. Jack stared at her, his disbelief evident. You can't be serious. But Emily didn't reply. Her eyes remained on Ethan, whose voice seemed to carry not just a melody, but a message, a call to remember what it meant to care, to connect, to truly see another person. As Jack walked away, his frustration palpable, Emily stayed rooted to the spot. Ethan finished his song, and Lila gave her a look of quiet understanding. Sometimes, Lila said softly, the smallest things make the biggest difference. Emily nodded, her heart heavy with both sadness and something like hope. She didn't know what had shifted within her, but she knew this moment, this boy, this song, had changed her. And nothing would ever be the same. The following morning, Emily Hawthorne stood at the large bay window of her Manhattan apartment, staring out at the city below. The bustling streets stretched endlessly, filled with cabs, commuters, and the relentless energy of New York. Yet, for the first time, the scene felt distant, like she was watching it from the wrong side of a glass. The boy's voice, Ethan's voice, lingered in her mind, hauntingly clear and unwavering. Behind her, Jack was pacing the length of their living room, his phone pressed to his ear. His voice carried that familiar sharp edge, full of authority and precision as he negotiated the details of their next business venture. Emily turned to look at him, the man she had built her life with, a man who thrived on control, success, and efficiency. She loved him, she reminded herself, but standing there, all she could think about was how disconnected she felt from the person she had once been. Emily. Jack's voice cut through her thoughts. He ended his call and turned to her, his expression one of impatience mixed with concern. Are you going to tell me what that was all about last night? Emily hesitated, her hand brushing against the smooth surface of the window. What do you mean? Jack gestured vaguely, his frustration bubbling. The boy, the singing. You practically froze in the middle of the street. We were late because of it. She sighed, turning away from the window. It wasn't about being late, Jack. It was more than that. Didn't you hear him? Didn't you see how happy he was? Even with so little? Jack ran a hand through his neatly combed hair. Emily, it's New York. There's a story like that on every block. You can't save everyone. That's just life. Emily's chest tightened. She could hear the practicality in his voice, the logic that had guided their decisions for years. But for the first time, it felt hollow. I'm not trying to save everyone, she said quietly. But that boy, Ethan, he reminded me of something I lost a long time ago. Jack frowned, stepping closer. What are you talking about? She hesitated, her mind flashing back to a younger version of herself, sitting in a sunlit backyard, listening to her brother's laughter as he sang a silly tune. She swallowed the lump rising in her throat. My brother, she said finally, her voice trembling. Before he passed, he loved to sing. The way Ethan sang last night, it brought everything back. The conversation left Jack puzzled. But Emily didn't push further. Over the next few days, she found herself drawn back to Times Square, wandering through the crowded streets, hoping to see Ethan again. Jack's words echoed in her mind. You can't save everyone. Yet she wasn't trying to save anyone. She was searching for something, for Ethan, for his voice, for the connection she had felt in that fleeting moment. One late afternoon, she spotted him. Ethan was back at his corner, holding the same toy microphone, his small frame swaying as he sang. A small crowd had gathered this time, tourists mostly, pausing to snap a quick photo or drop a coin in his jar. Emily stood at a distance, her heart aching as she watched. When Ethan paused to take a breath, she stepped forward. Ethan, she called softly. He turned, his face lighting up with recognition. "Oh, hi, lady," he said, grinning. "You came back." Emily crouched to his level, smiling. "I wanted to hear you sing again." Ethan's eyes sparkled. "You like my songs?" "I do," Emily said, her voice warm. "You're very talented. You have a gift." Ethan puffed up with pride, clutching his microphone. "That's what my mama says. She says it's from God." Before Emily could respond, a familiar voice cut through the air. "Ethan, what did I tell you about staying in one place?" Lila Morales appeared, her expression both relieved and exasperated. She hurried over, placing a protective hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Sorry if he's bothering you," she said to Emily, her tone polite but weary. "He's not bothering me," Emily said quickly. "I'm glad I found him. He's remarkable." Lila studied her for a moment, her tired eyes softening. "Thank you. That means a lot. He's always loved to sing." She paused, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I just wish it didn't have to be out here." They sat together on a nearby bench while Ethan played with his microphone nearby. Lila shared pieces of her life, a single mother juggling 2 part-time jobs, struggling to make rent in a city that seemed designed to crush the vulnerable. Ethan's singing, she explained, wasn't just for fun. It was a way to help keep their spirits up. A way for him to feel like he was contributing. "It's not fair," Emily said, her voice thick with emotion. "You're doing everything you can. And it's still not enough." Lila shrugged, a small, bitter smile tugging at her lips. "Fair doesn't really exist when you're at the bottom." Emily's heart ached at the quiet strength in Lila's voice. She thought of her own life, the comforts, the privileges, and felt a pang of guilt. "Is there anything I can do to help?" Lila looked at her, surprised. "You've already done more than most by just listening." That evening, Emily returned to the apartment, her thoughts swirling. She found Jack in the kitchen, pouring himself a glass of wine. He glanced at her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Where were you?" She hesitated, setting her purse on the counter. "I went back to Times Square." Jack's jaw tightened. "Let me guess. The boy again?" "His name is Ethan," Emily said, her voice firm. "And yes, I went to see him. I also met his mother. She's..." "Emily, stop," Jack interrupted, his voice rising. "This is getting ridiculous. You don't know these people. You can't just insert yourself into their lives." Emily crossed her arms, her frustration bubbling over. "Why not? If I can help, why shouldn't I?" "Because it's not your responsibility," Jack snapped, slamming his glass on the counter. "We have our own lives, our own problems." Emily stared at him, her chest heaving. "What problems, Jack? Paying for a vacation home? Choosing which gala to attend next? Don't you see how empty that all is?" Jack's face darkened, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. "Don't you dare act like our life doesn't matter. We've worked hard for this." Emily shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "But for what? To pretend we're happy while people like Lila are fighting to survive?" The room fell silent, the weight of their argument hanging heavy between them. Jack turned away, his shoulders tense. "I don't know who you're becoming, Emily," he said quietly, "but it's not the woman I married." Emily felt her heart crack, but she stood her ground. "Maybe that's the problem," she whispered. "Maybe the woman you married wasn't who I was meant to be." The days that followed were heavy with unspoken tension between Emily and Jack. Their conversations were brief and superficial, orbiting around logistics and appearances without ever touching the rawness beneath. Emily had always been skilled at keeping up pretenses, but now the facade felt suffocating. Ethan's voice and Lila's quiet strength lingered in her thoughts, demanding attention in a way that nothing else did. On a gray afternoon, Emily found herself heading toward Times Square again. She told Jack she was running errands, a half-truth that sat uncomfortably on her tongue. But she didn't care. Her feet seemed to move on their own, carrying her to the corner where she had first heard Ethan sing. This time, Lila was already there, standing a few steps behind Ethan as he sang. She was holding a paper bag, her eyes scanning the crowd with quiet vigilance. When she saw Emily approaching, her expression shifted from surprise to guarded warmth. "You're back," Lila said, her voice low but not unkind. "I couldn't stay away," Emily admitted, glancing at Ethan. He was belting out a familiar tune, his small frame swaying with the rhythm. "I needed to hear him again." Lila smiled faintly. "He has that effect on people." They stood in silence for a moment, watching as a small group of tourists gathered to listen. A few dropped coins into Ethan's jar. and his smile grew wider with each clink. Does he sing every day? Emily asked. Most days, Lila said, when I'm working or dealing with things. She hesitated, glancing at Emily. Things like our landlord. Emily frowned. Your landlord? Lila let out a humorless laugh. Victor Harrington. He owns the building we live in, or what's left of it. He's been trying to force us out for months. Claims he needs to renovate, but we all know he just wants to raise the rent. Emily felt a spark of anger ignite in her chest. That's illegal, isn't it? He can't just evict you without cause. Lila shrugged, her expression weary. Illegal doesn't mean much when you can't afford a lawyer. Harrington knows that. He counts on people like me being too tired, too broke, or too scared to fight back. The words hung in the air, heavy with injustice. Emily's mind raced. She thought of the resources at her disposal, the connections, the influence. For years, she had used those tools to climb higher, to secure her place among New York's elite. But now, for the first time, she wondered if they could be used for something that actually mattered. Have you tried reaching out to anyone for help? She asked. Lila gave her a sideways glance. Help doesn't come free, Emily. Not in this city. That night, back at the apartment, Emily found herself pacing the living room, her thoughts a chaotic tangle. Jack sat on the couch, scrolling through his phone, his face illuminated by the blue light of the screen. Jack, she said, stopping in front of him. He didn't look up. Do you know anyone who works in housing law? That got his attention. He set his phone down, his brow furrowing. Housing law? Why would you? His expression darkened. Is this about that boy again? His mother, Emily corrected, her voice firm. She's being threatened by her landlord. It's illegal, and they have no way to fight back. Jack sighed, leaning back against the couch. Emily, we've talked about this. You can't fix every broken situation you come across. I'm not trying to fix everything, she snapped. I can't stand by and do nothing. Not when I could actually help. Jack stared at her, his frustration evident. And what about us? What about the life we've built? Do you think this, whatever this is, matters more than that? Emily's chest tightened. She wanted to scream, to shake him and make him see what she saw. But she knew it was pointless. Jack had always measured value in terms of success, status, and security. Anything that didn't fit into that framework was dismissed as irrelevant. I'm not asking you to understand, she said quietly, but I need you to trust me. Jack's expression hardened. I don't know if I can. Despite Jack's resistance, Emily began spending more time with Lila and Ethan. She helped them research tenant rights, connecting them with a housing advocacy group in the city. The group introduced them to Karen Blake, a no-nonsense lawyer with a reputation for taking on powerful landlords. Karen's passion for justice was palpable, and she agreed to take on Lila's case pro bono. Ethan, meanwhile, became a beacon of light in Emily's increasingly complicated life. His joy was infectious, his resilience inspiring. He sang as if nothing could touch him, as if every note was a declaration of hope. You know, he said one afternoon as Emily sat beside him on the sidewalk. You should sing too. Emily laughed, shaking her head. I don't think I'm any good. Ethan grinned. Doesn't matter. Singing makes you happy, even if you're bad at it. His words stayed with her long after she left. At home, the distance between Emily and Jack grew. He avoided conversations about Lila and Ethan, retreating into his work instead. Emily, for her part, stopped trying to bridge the gap. She knew she couldn't force Jack to see what she saw, couldn't make him feel the pull she felt towards something bigger than herself. One night, as she prepared to leave for another meeting with Karen and Lila, Jack confronted her. Emily, this has to stop, he said, his voice low and controlled. You're spending more time with them than with me. Is that what you want? She paused, her hand on the doorknob. I want to make a difference. Jack, I want to feel like my life means something. And our life doesn't mean anything to you? He asked, his voice breaking. Emily turned to face him, her eyes filled with tears. Not if it's just about climbing higher and higher. Jack, not if we lose ourselves along the way. The argument left Emily shaken, but it didn't deter her. She knew the fight against Harrington would be long and grueling, but she was ready. For Lila, for Ethan, for the countless others like them who had been silenced and overlooked. She didn't know if Jack would ever come around, didn't know if their marriage could survive the growing divide between them. But she did know one thing, she couldn't go back to the way things were. Not after everything she had seen and felt. As she walked into the cool night air, heading toward her next meeting, she whispered a silent promise to herself. I will not turn away. Not again. The sharp winter wind cut through the streets of New York, carrying with it the unmistakable hum of a city in motion. The fight against Victor Harrington, the ruthless landlord, had officially begun. For Emily Hawthorne, this was no longer about a single mother and her son. It was about exposing a system that preyed on the vulnerable while the powerful thrived unchecked. Emily sat in a small conference room at the offices of the Urban Justice Legal Center. Flanked by Lila Morales and her lawyer, Karen Blake, the room was unremarkable, with its mismatched chairs and flickering fluorescent lights. But the air was thick with purpose. Karen leaned forward, her glasses perched low on her nose as she laid out the strategy. Harrington's track record is bad, worse than I thought, she said, sliding a folder across the table. Unlawful evictions, neglecting repairs, threatening tenants. The problem is, he's careful. He knows how to skirt the law. Emily flipped through the folder, her stomach churning at the pictures of mold-covered walls, broken heating systems, and piles of eviction notices. How has he gotten away with this for so long? She asked. Incredulous. Karen's mouth set into a hard line. Because no one's had the resources or the courage to fight back. Until now. Lila shifted in her seat, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. I'm scared, she admitted. What if he comes after us? Karen placed a hand on Lila's. He'll try, but that's why we're here, to make sure he doesn't win. Emily felt a surge of determination. You're not alone in this, Lila, she said firmly. We're going to fight him. And we're going to win. At home, Jack was less enthusiastic about Emily's newfound crusade. The growing rift between them felt like an unspoken shadow, lingering in every conversation. Emily, we need to talk, Jack said one evening, his tone sharp but controlled. Emily sighed, setting down her coffee. What is it now? He leaned against the kitchen counter, his arms crossed. This thing with the Moraleses, it's taken over your life. I barely see you anymore. Her eyebrows shot up. I'm trying to help people, Jack, people who don't have the kind of privilege we take for granted every day. And what about us? He demanded. What about our life? Our plans? Does that just not matter anymore? Emily stared at him, her chest tightening. Jack, what good are our plans if they don't mean anything? If we're just climbing higher for the sake of it? Jack's jaw tightened, his frustration palpable. You're throwing everything away for some family you barely know. Her voice rose, sharp with anger. Because someone has to care. Jack, someone has to do something. The argument ended in silence. Jack retreating to their bedroom, leaving Emily alone in the kitchen. She stared out the window, the city lights blurring as tears filled her eyes. She didn't know how to bridge the growing divide between them, but she couldn't turn back now. The case against Harrington began to draw attention. Karen's team filed an injunction to halt the evictions, and the media picked up the story. Local news channels ran segments on Lila's plight, interviewing her outside her apartment building as neighbors rallied around her. But not all attention was positive. Online, anonymous commenters accused Lila of freeloading and questioned her character. Emily received messages from acquaintances urging her to be careful about associating with those people. The thinly veiled racism and classism made her blood boil. At a charity luncheon, one of Emily's old friends, Madeline Connors, approached her with a tight smile. Emily, darling, Madeline said, her voice dripping with faux concern. I heard about your involvement with that eviction case. Is everything all right? Emily forced a polite smile. Everything's fine, Madeline, just trying to help someone who needs it. Madeline's eyebrows arched. Of course, but you must be careful. These things can get messy. Emily's patience snapped. Messy? You mean inconvenient for people like us? Madeline blinked, taken aback. I didn't mean. Yes, you did, Emily said coldly, before walking away. As the legal team dug deeper, they uncovered evidence of Harrington's shady dealings, falsified maintenance records, forged eviction notices, and backdoor deals with city officials. But Harrington was prepared. He hired a high-powered legal team and began a smear campaign against Lila, painting her as an ungrateful tenant who refused to pay rent. One evening, as Emily sat with Lila in her apartment, they heard a loud bang at the door. Ethan froze, his toy microphone clutched in his hand. Lila's face paled as she opened the door to find an eviction notice taped to it. "He's trying to scare us," Lila whispered, her voice trembling. Emily took a picture of the notice with her phone. "He's desperate," she said. "That means we're getting to him." Meanwhile, Jack was beginning to feel the weight of Emily's absence. One night, he attended a gala alone, fielding questions about his wife's whereabouts. For the first time, he felt the hollow nature of these events, the forced smiles, the meaningless small talk. He thought of Emily's words. What good are our plans if they don't mean anything? Back at their apartment, he poured himself a glass of scotch and sat in the dark, his mind racing. He couldn't understand why Emily was so drawn to these people, but he couldn't ignore the growing fear that he was losing her. The next court hearing was pivotal. Karen presented evidence of Harrington's fraud, and Lila testified about the harassment and threats she had endured. Her voice trembled at first, but as she spoke about Ethan, his joy, his resilience, her strength grew. Harrington's lawyer countered with slick arguments, painting Lila as unreliable and accusing her of fabricating the claims. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. As Emily sat in the gallery, her hands clenched in her lap, she noticed Jack slip in through the back. Their eyes met briefly, and something in his expression shifted, an acknowledgement of the stakes, perhaps, or of Emily's unwavering resolve. When the judge announced that the case would proceed to trial, Lila broke down in tears. Emily hugged her tightly, feeling both relief and the weight of the battle still ahead. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Karen, Lila, and Emily, shouting questions about the case. Harrington stood off to the side, his expression smug despite the setback. He locked eyes with Emily and gave her a slow, taunting smile. "You think this is over?" he said as he walked past her. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Emily's jaw tightened, her resolve hardening. "Neither do you." The tension surrounding the case against Victor Harrington only grew as the trial date loomed. The fight for justice became more than just a legal battle, it was a war of resilience, testing everyone involved. For Emily Hawthorne, it was a collision of worlds, the sheltered privilege she had always known and the raw, unfiltered struggle of those like Lila Morales and her son Ethan. The case became a lightning rod for debate in New York. Media outlets latched onto the story, pitting narratives of greed and exploitation against the struggles of single mothers like Lila. Protesters gathered outside Harrington's properties, chanting slogans and waving signs that read, "Justice for tenants," and "Stop Harrington now." Emily watched from a distance, torn between admiration for the growing movement and the discomfort of being thrust into the public eye. Her name was now linked to the case, and with that came a flood of online vitriol. Social media buzzed with polarized opinions, some calling her a hero for standing up to Harrington, while others branded her as a naive socialite meddling in matters she didn't understand. At home, Jack's frustration boiled over. "Do you have any idea what people are saying about us?" he demanded one night, slamming his phone onto the table. "I just had to explain to a client why my wife is marching with protesters in the streets." Emily's voice was calm but firm. "I'm doing what's right, Jack. If that embarrasses you, maybe you need to think about why." Jack stared at her, his eyes a storm of disbelief and anger. "You're jeopardizing everything we've built." "No," she said quietly, meeting his gaze. "I'm building something new, something that actually matters." The rift between Emily and Jack deepened. They began spending less time together, their conversations reduced to surface-level pleasantries. Emily found solace in her growing friendship with Lila, who offered her a perspective she had never experienced before. One night, as they sat in Lila's small kitchen, Emily asked, "How do you keep going? With everything stacked against you?" Lila shrugged, her expression weary but resolute. "You don't have a choice when you've got a kid depending on you. Ethan keeps me grounded, as long as he's smiling. I know I can't give up." Emily nodded, her thoughts drifting to Jack. She wondered if they had ever truly depended on each other in that way, or if their relationship had always been about convenience and shared ambition. Harrington, meanwhile, intensified his efforts to undermine Lila and her legal team. He hired private investigators to dig into her past, hoping to find something, anything, that could discredit her. When that failed, he turned to more direct tactics. One night, as Lila and Ethan returned home from a visit to a friend's house, they found their apartment vandalized. The locks were broken, The few belongings they had were strewn across the floor. And a chilling message was scrawled on the wall: "Leave. Or else." Emily arrived shortly after, having received a panicked call from Lila. She stood in the doorway, her stomach twisting at the sight of the destruction. "He's trying to scare you," Emily said, her voice trembling with anger. "But we won't let him win." Lila hugged Ethan tightly, her face pale but her jaw set. "He can try all he wants. I'm not going anywhere." Jack, despite his outward frustration, found himself unable to ignore the case entirely. He started reading the news coverage, watching clips of the protests and court hearings. One night, he came across a video of Ethan singing outside the courthouse, his small voice unwavering despite the chaos around him. For the first time, Jack felt a pang of something unfamiliar: guilt. He couldn't shake the image of the boy's earnest smile, the innocence in his voice. He thought about Emily, about the fire in her eyes when she talked about the case. She was fighting for something real, something he had never truly understood. Jack poured himself another drink, staring out the window of their apartment. He didn't know how to bridge the growing gap between them, but he was beginning to see that ignoring it wasn't the answer. At the next pretrial hearing, Karen Blake delivered a bombshell. A former employee of Harrington's, Daniel Vargas, had come forward with damning evidence. Vargas, a maintenance worker at one of Harrington's buildings, testified that he had been ordered to falsify repair reports and intimidate tenants into leaving. Harrington's lawyer, Melinda Crane, immediately tried to discredit Vargas, accusing him of fabricating his story for financial gain. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as Vargas stood his ground, his voice steady despite the sharp cross-examination. Emily sat in the gallery, her hands clenched in her lap. She glanced at Jack, who had slipped into the courtroom moments earlier. Their eyes met briefly, and she saw a flicker of something in his expression: acknowledgement, perhaps, or even regret. When the hearing adjourned, Karen approached Emily and Lila with a determined look. "This changes everything," she said. "If we can prove Harrington's pattern of fraud, we have a real shot at winning." The revelations from Vargas emboldened the legal team, but they also painted a target on his back. A week after his testimony, Vargas's car was found torched outside his apartment. Though no one could prove Harrington's involvement, the message was clear. Lila grew more anxious, constantly looking over her shoulder. Ethan, despite his mother's attempts to shield him, sensed the tension. "Is the bad man going to make us leave?" he asked one night. His voice small. Lila crouched down, placing a hand on his cheek. "No, baby," she said softly. "We're going to stay, and we're going to fight." Emily, who had been sitting nearby, felt a surge of admiration for Lila's strength. She made a silent vow to see this fight through, no matter the cost. As the trial date approached, the pressure mounted. Harrington's team filed motion after motion to delay proceedings, hoping to exhaust Lila and her legal team. Karen pushed back relentlessly, refusing to let him stall their momentum. Meanwhile, Emily began to feel the weight of the choices she had made. Her relationship with Jack was teetering on the edge. Her social circle had largely turned its back on her, and the vitriol from Harrington's supporters was relentless. Yet, through it all, she felt a sense of purpose she hadn't known in years. One evening, as she walked home from a meeting with Karen, she found Jack waiting for her on the couch. His tie was loosened, and his face was lined with exhaustion. "We need to talk," he said quietly. Emily hesitated, then sat down across from him. "About what?" Jack rubbed the back of his neck, his gaze meeting hers. "About us. About everything." The weight in his voice told her this wasn't going to be easy. But for the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way forward together. The day of the trial arrived, ushering in a chill that seemed to seep into the very marrow of the city. The courthouse loomed large, its steps crowded with reporters, activists, and curious onlookers. Emily Hawthorne stood at the base of those steps, her breath visible in the cold morning air. Beside her were Lila Morales and her lawyer, Karen Blake, both of them resolute despite the enormity of what lay ahead. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation. On one side sat Victor Harrington, his sharp suit and confident smirk an affront to the seriousness of the proceedings. His lawyer, Melinda Crane, radiated the polished menace of someone used to dismantling opponents with precision. On the other side, Karen opened with a blistering statement. She painted a vivid picture of Harrington's years of exploitation, the falsified records, the harassment of tenants, and the sheer disregard for human decency. "This is not just about one family," Karen said, her voice steady but fierce. "This is about a pattern of abuse that has gone unchecked for far too long." When it was Crane's turn, her tone was calm, almost dismissive. She portrayed Harrington as a savvy businessman whose actions were misunderstood, and accused Lila of being a disgruntled tenant trying to game the system. Emily watched Lila shift uncomfortably in her seat. The smear campaign was working, and Emily could feel the tension radiating off her friend. During a recess, Emily found Ethan in the hallway, holding his toy microphone. He was sitting on a bench, his legs swinging as he hummed a tune. His innocence was a stark contrast to the high-stakes battle unfolding inside. "Are you okay?" Emily asked. Sitting beside him, Ethan looked up and nodded, but his small voice betrayed his unease. "Mom is scared. I don't like it when she's scared." Emily placed a hand on his shoulder. "Your mom is the bravest person I know, and we're going to help her." Ethan smiled faintly, clutching his microphone tighter. "Do you think the judge will like my singing? I think if he hears me, he'll know we're good people." Emily felt her throat tighten. "I think anyone who hears you sing will know how special you are." When Lila took the stand, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Karen guided her through her testimony, allowing her to recount the months of harassment she had endured, the threatening notices, the deliberate neglect of repairs, and the vandalism that left her and Ethan frightened in their own home. Harrington's lawyer wasted no time in attacking her credibility. Crane's questions were sharp, her tone dripping with condescension. "Mrs. Morales," Crane said, pacing in front of the jury, "isn't it true that you've fallen behind on your rent multiple times?" Lila's voice trembled but didn't break. "Yes, but only because my hours were cut at work. I always paid as soon as I could." "And isn't it also true," Crane continued, "that you've received multiple warnings about noise complaints related to your son?" Lila's hands clenched in her lap. "Ethan sings. That's not noise. That's joy." A ripple of murmurs spread through the gallery, but the judge quickly silenced it. Emily's chest tightened as she watched Lila hold her ground, her dignity intact despite Crane's relentless attacks. The trial's most dramatic moment came when Daniel Vargas, the former maintenance worker, took the stand. His testimony was a devastating blow to Harrington's case. Vargas described, in painstaking detail, how he was ordered to falsify records and threatened tenants into leaving. "He told me," Vargas said, his voice steady despite the tension in the room, "that people like Lila Morales didn't deserve to live in his buildings. That they were just problems waiting to happen." Karen leaned forward. "And did you follow those orders?" "At first," Vargas admitted, his eyes cast downward, "but I couldn't keep doing it. I quit because I couldn't live with myself." When Crane began her cross-examination, her tone was icy. She tried to paint Vargas as a disgruntled former employee seeking revenge. But he didn't waver. His testimony stood, unshaken by her efforts. As the trial progressed, Harrington's confidence began to crack. He made the mistake of taking the stand himself, confident he could outmaneuver Karen's questioning. It quickly became clear that he had underestimated her. Karen's questions were surgical, slicing through his carefully rehearsed defenses. She presented emails showing his instructions to neglect repairs and pressure tenants. She highlighted inconsistencies in his previous statements, forcing him to admit to several oversights. By the time he stepped down, his smug demeanor had all but disappeared. Emily was surprised when Jack walked into the courtroom during one of the trial's final days. He took a seat at the back, his expression unreadable. She hadn't expected him to come, but his presence filled her with a complicated mix of hope and unease. During a break, Jack approached her in the hallway. "You're really going all in on this, aren't you?" he asked, his tone softer than she expected. "I have to," Emily said simply. "It's the right thing to do." Jack sighed, shoving his hands into his pockets. "I still don't get it. But I see how much it means to you." Emily felt her throat tighten. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Karen's closing argument was a masterpiece of conviction. She reminded the jury of the systemic abuse Harrington had perpetuated, of the courage it took for Lila and Vargas to stand up to him, and of the stakes for families like the Moraleses. "This case is about more than one family or one landlord," Karen said, her voice resonating through the courtroom. It's about justice. It's about sending a message that people like Victor Harrington cannot continue to exploit the most vulnerable among us. Crane's closing argument leaned heavily on doubt, urging the jury to question the motives of the plaintiffs and witnesses. Her words were polished, but they lacked the emotional weight that Karen's carried. After hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their decision. The tension in the courtroom was unbearable as the foreperson stood to read the verdict. On the charge of unlawful eviction practices, we find the defendant, Victor Harrington, guilty. The room erupted in gasps and murmurs. Lila covered her mouth with her hands, tears streaming down her face. Ethan hugged her tightly, his toy microphone clattering to the floor. Emily felt a wave of relief and triumph wash over her. She glanced at Jack, who gave her a small, tentative nod. It wasn't reconciliation, but it was a start. As reporters swarmed Lila and Karen outside the courthouse, Emily hung back, watching the scene unfold. Harrington was whisked away by his legal team, his expression dark and unreadable. The fight wasn't over, there would be appeals, and Harrington's influence wouldn't disappear overnight. But for now, justice had been served, and for the first time in a long time, Emily felt like she was exactly where she needed to be. She turned to Jack, who had joined her at the edge of the crowd. "So," she said, her voice steady, "are you ready to start seeing things my way?" Jack gave her a faint smile. "I think I just might be." The courthouse steps were alive with chaos. Reporters swarmed like bees, thrusting microphones and cameras at Lila Morales, her lawyer Karen Blake, and even Emily Hawthorne, who lingered at the edge of the crowd. Questions rained down like the cold February drizzle. "Lila, how does it feel to win?" "Karen, what's next for Harrington?" "Emily, what's your connection to this case?" Amid the noise, Ethan Morales clung tightly to his mother's hand, his toy microphone dangling from his other. His wide eyes darted between the flashing cameras and the shouting reporters. Emily crouched down beside him, placing a steadying hand on his shoulder. "You okay, champ?" she asked, her voice soft. Ethan nodded but didn't speak. The intensity of the moment seemed to weigh on him, even as he tried to stay brave. Emily gave him a warm smile. "You were amazing in there," she said. "You and your mom both." As the crowd pressed closer, Karen raised her voice, cutting through the chaos. "That's enough for today. Mrs. Morales and her son need some space." With a firm gesture, she ushered Lila and Ethan toward a waiting car. Emily followed them at a distance, her thoughts swirling. The trial was over, and Harrington had been held accountable, for now. But the fight had exposed cracks in a system far larger than one corrupt landlord. And while Lila and Ethan had won a measure of justice, it was clear that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The days following the verdict were bittersweet. Harrington was ordered to pay significant damages and implement sweeping changes in his properties. But his legal team immediately filed an appeal. The battle was far from over. For Lila, the relief of the verdict was tempered by the lingering fear of retaliation. She moved cautiously through her day-to-day life, always glancing over her shoulder, always wondering if Harrington or his associates might try to exact revenge. The relief of winning was real, but so was the anxiety that came with it. For Emily, the fallout was personal. Her involvement in the case had made her a polarizing figure among her social circle. At dinner parties and charity events, she became the subject of whispers and sidelong glances. Friends she had once considered close began to distance themselves, their discomfort with her activism palpable. One evening, Emily and Jack sat on opposite ends of their sleek dining table, the silence between them heavy. The meal lay untouched, the tension lingering from an earlier argument. "You've changed," Jack said finally, his voice low. "You're not the woman I married." Emily looked at him, her gaze steady. "Maybe I wasn't supposed to stay the woman you married. Maybe I was supposed to grow." Jack sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I don't know if I can keep up with you, Emily." She leaned forward, her tone softening. "Jack, I don't need you to have all the answers. I just need you to try. To see why this matters to me." For a long moment, Jack said nothing. Then, with a quiet resolve, he nodded. "I'm trying," he said. "I promise I'm trying." It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a start. Lila used part of the damages awarded in the case to move her family to a safer, more stable neighborhood. Their new apartment was modest but clean. And for the first time in years, Lila felt like she could breathe. Ethan's school performance improved, his cheerful nature shining even brighter now that the constant worry of eviction no longer loomed over them. Emily visited them often, bringing small gifts for Ethan and helping Lila navigate her next steps. "You should write a book about everything you've been through," Emily suggested one afternoon, sipping coffee in Lila's tiny kitchen. Lila laughed, shaking her head. "Who would read it?" Emily smiled. "More people than you think." Emily's life began to shift in profound ways. She resigned from her position on the board of a high-profile charity, tired of its superficial focus on appearances over impact. Instead, she threw herself into advocacy, volunteering with housing justice organizations and speaking out about systemic inequities. Her name became synonymous with tenant rights. And while some in her old social circle scoffed, others began to see her as a genuine force for change. Even Jack, who initially struggled to understand her transformation, started attending events with her, watching as she spoke with a passion he hadn't seen in years. One evening, after a community forum, Jack pulled her aside. "You're incredible," he said simply. His words were sincere, his admiration clear. It was the first time in a long time that Emily felt truly seen by him. Though Harrington's appeal dragged on for months, his reputation took a nosedive. More tenants came forward with stories of neglect and harassment, their voices amplified by the momentum of Lila's case. The media coverage was relentless, painting Harrington as a symbol of greed and corruption. By the time the appellate court upheld the original verdict, Harrington's empire was crumbling, his properties were subject to stricter oversight, and his once invincible image was irreparably tarnished. For Emily, the victory was bittersweet. Harrington had been punished, but the systemic issues he represented were far from resolved. Still, she held on to the hope that this was the beginning of something bigger, a spark that could ignite lasting change. Months later, at a community event in Central Park, Emily watched as Ethan took the stage. The organizers had asked him to sing, and he stood there, his small frame dwarfed by the microphone stand. But when he opened his mouth, his voice filled the air, clear and pure. The crowd fell silent, captivated by the simple beauty of his song. Emily felt tears prick her eyes as she listened. The memory of that first night she heard him rushing back. She glanced at Lila, who was standing nearby, her face glowing with pride. As the song ended, the crowd erupted into applause. Ethan beamed, waving shyly as he stepped down from the stage. He ran to Emily, his toy microphone still clutched in his hand. "Did I do good?" he asked, his eyes wide with hope. Emily crouched down, smiling through her tears. "You did amazing, Ethan. You always do." Emily and Jack walked home that evening, hand in hand. The city was quieter, the streets bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. For the first time in a long time, Emily felt a sense of peace. "What's next for us?" Jack asked, his tone thoughtful. Emily smiled, squeezing his hand. "Whatever it is," she said, "I want it to mean something." Jack nodded, his gaze steady. "Then we'll figure it out together." As they turned the corner, the faint sound of a street performer's guitar drifted through the air. Emily paused, listening to the music, her heart swelling with gratitude and hope. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time, Emily felt ready to face whatever came next. She wasn't just living anymore. She was making a difference. And that was enough. Months passed, but the impact of the trial rippled far beyond the courthouse. Emily Hawthorne found herself at the center of a growing movement, one she hadn't planned to lead but couldn't walk away from. The momentum created by Lila Morales's case had inspired others to come forward, sharing their stories of exploitation and resilience. What started as one case against Victor Harrington had sparked a larger conversation about housing inequality in New York City. Emily sat in a packed community center in Harlem, surrounded by tenants, activists, and legal advocates. The room buzzed with energy as people shared their struggles and brainstormed solutions. Lila sat beside her, quietly taking notes while Karen Blake led the discussion at the front of the room. "Every case matters," Karen said, her voice commanding the room. "What happened to Lila and Ethan wasn't an isolated incident. It's happening all over this city. And it's going to keep happening unless we hold people accountable." Emily raised her hand, and Karen nodded for her to speak. "We need to focus on more than just individual cases," she said. "We need policy changes, laws that protect tenants from predatory landlords." That's the only way to make a lasting impact. A murmur of agreement spread through the room, and Emily felt a swell of purpose. The meeting ended with plans to organize a citywide rally, one that would draw attention to the systemic issues facing renters. At home, Emily found Jack waiting for her, an open laptop on the coffee table. He looked up as she entered, his expression a mix of curiosity and determination. "How was the meeting?" he asked. "Intense," Emily replied, shrugging off her coat. "But good, we're planning a rally." Jack gestured to the laptop. "I've been reading about housing laws, how they're structured, how landlords like Harrington exploit loopholes. It's complicated." Emily raised an eyebrow, surprised. "You've been reading about housing laws?" Jack smiled sheepishly. "I told you I was trying, didn't I?" She walked over and kissed him on the cheek. "Thank you," she said softly. "That means more than you know." The rally took place on a crisp spring afternoon in Union Square, drawing hundreds of people from all walks of life. Emily stood on the makeshift stage, her heart pounding as she prepared to speak. Beside her, Ethan clutched his toy microphone, his face glowing with excitement. "Are you nervous?" she asked him. He shook his head, grinning. "Nope, I like singing for people." Emily laughed, feeling her own nerves ease. When it was her turn to speak, she stepped forward, scanning the crowd. Faces looked back at her, young and old, hopeful and weary, but united in their purpose. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice steady. "This isn't just about one case or one family. It's about a system that prioritizes profit over people, that treats homes as commodities instead of human necessities. We can do better. We must do better." The crowd erupted into applause, and Emily stepped back, letting Ethan take the microphone. His clear, pure voice rose above the noise of the city, silencing the crowd. His song wasn't just a performance, it was a reminder of why they were all there. In the weeks following the rally, Emily received an invitation to meet with Councilwoman Ava Brooks, a progressive politician who had been following the case closely. The meeting took place in Brooks's office, a cluttered but welcoming space filled with books and posters advocating for social justice. "I've been impressed by what you've accomplished," Brooks said, gesturing for Emily to sit. "You've mobilized people in a way that politicians often can't. I think we can work together to push for real change." Emily felt both excited and overwhelmed. "I'm not a politician," she admitted. "I'm just someone who got involved because I couldn't look away." "That's exactly why you're the right person to help," Brooks said. "People trust you because they know you're genuine. Let's use that to make a difference." As Emily became more involved in advocacy work, she encouraged Lila to join her. At first, Lila was hesitant. "I'm not like you," she said. "I'm not used to speaking in front of crowds or working with politicians." "You don't have to be like me," Emily replied. "Just be yourself. Your story is powerful, and people need to hear it." Lila eventually agreed, taking on a role as a community organizer. She worked tirelessly to help other tenants understand their rights, her quiet strength inspiring those around her. Ethan often joined her, his ever-present microphone turning him into a beloved fixture at meetings and rallies. Though Harrington's influence had waned, he wasn't done fighting. His legal team filed another appeal, claiming procedural errors in the original trial. The move was a clear attempt to drag out the process and intimidate his opponents. Emily received a letter one afternoon, its contents chilling. It was an anonymous note warning her to stay out of things that don't concern you. She showed it to Jack, who immediately called Karen. "This is crossing the line," Jack said, his voice tight with anger. "Whoever sent this needs to be held accountable." Karen assured them that the note would be reported to the authorities. But the incident only reinforced how high the stakes were. The threat against Emily seemed to flip a switch in Jack. He began attending more meetings, offering his expertise in strategy and networking. He even organized a fundraiser to support legal aid for tenants, drawing on his connections in the corporate world. At the fundraiser, Jack stood beside Emily as she spoke to the crowd. When she finished, he took the microphone. "I've spent most of my life focused on success," he admitted, "but watching Emily fight for something bigger than herself has made me realize how much more we can do. This isn't just her fight anymore. It's ours." The applause that followed was thunderous, and Emily felt tears prick her eyes. For the first time, she truly believed they were in this together. By summer, Emily and her growing coalition had gained significant traction. They worked with Councilwoman Brooks to draft legislation aimed at closing the loopholes Harrington and others like him had exploited. The bill, dubbed the Housing Justice Act, became a rallying point for the movement. At a press conference announcing the bill, Emily stood beside Brooks, Lila, and Karen. "This is just the beginning," she said. "We've proven that when people come together, they can achieve incredible things. But there's still so much work to do." As the press snapped photos and the crowd cheered, Emily felt a deep sense of purpose. The journey that had begun on a street corner in Times Square had transformed her life, and she was determined to see it through. The summer heat hung heavy over New York City as the momentum behind the Housing Justice Act reached its peak. What had started as a single legal battle against Victor Harrington had blossomed into a citywide movement for housing reform. For Emily Hawthorne, this was both the culmination of her journey and the beginning of something greater. The night before the City Council vote on the Housing Justice Act, Emily found herself standing in the modest kitchen of Lila Morales's new apartment. The two women were reviewing their planned remarks for the council meeting while Ethan, ever the performer, practiced a new song for the rally that would precede the vote. "I'm nervous," Lila admitted, her fingers clutching a mug of tea. "What if they don't pass it?" "They will," Emily said firmly. "We've come too far for them to ignore us now." Lila gave her a small, grateful smile. "You've done so much, Emily. I don't even know how to thank you." Emily reached across the table, placing a hand over Lila's. "You don't have to thank me. We did this together." Meanwhile, Jack was finalizing last-minute arrangements for the rally. The fundraiser he had organized had been a resounding success, allowing the coalition to secure permits, hire legal counsel, and expand their outreach efforts. Jack, once hesitant to involve himself in Emily's crusade, now found himself immersed in the movement. As he worked late into the night, Emily returned home and leaned against the doorway of their office, watching him with quiet admiration. "You're incredible," she said softly. Jack looked up, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Takes one to know one." Emily crossed the room, wrapping her arms around him. "Whatever happens tomorrow, I'm glad we're in this together." Jack kissed her forehead. "Always." The next morning, Union Square was a sea of signs, banners, and determined faces. Thousands had gathered to support the Housing Justice Act, their chants echoing through the city. Emily stood at the front of the crowd with Lila, Ethan, and Karen Blake by her side. When it was Emily's turn to speak, she stepped up to the podium, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She glanced at Jack, who gave her a reassuring nod, and then at Ethan, who held his toy microphone with a look of quiet pride. "This is about more than housing," Emily began, her voice clear and steady. "It's about dignity. It's about justice. It's about ensuring that no one in this city has to choose between paying rent and putting food on the table. Today, we have the chance to make history, to stand up for what's right. Let's not waste it." The crowd erupted into cheers, their energy electrifying. As Emily stepped down, Ethan ran up to her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "That was awesome," he said, beaming. Emily laughed, ruffling his hair. "Your turn now, superstar." Ethan climbed onto the stage, his small voice carrying over the crowd as he sang a heartfelt rendition of "This Little Light of Mine." The audience swayed and clapped along, their spirits lifted by his unshakable optimism. Inside the city council chambers, the atmosphere was tense. Activists packed the gallery, their presence a silent reminder of the stakes. Council members debated fiercely, some arguing that the bill was too ambitious, while others championed it as a necessary step toward equity. Emily and Lila sat side by side, their hands clasped tightly. Jack sat a few rows behind them, his jaw set with determination. Karen stood at the ready, prepared to counter any last-minute challenges to the bill. When the vote was finally called, the room fell silent. One by one, the council members cast their votes. The tally climbed, each, yes, sending a wave of hope through the gallery. When the final vote was read, 19 in favor, 6 against, the room erupted in cheers and applause. Lila turned to Emily, tears streaming down her face. "We did it," she whispered. Emily hugged her tightly, her own eyes brimming with tears. "You did it, Lila. You never gave up." The passage of the Housing Justice Act marked a turning point for the city. The new legislation closed loopholes that landlords like Harrington had exploited for years, strengthened tenant protections, and increased funding for affordable housing initiatives. The coalition celebrated their victory. But they also knew that the fight for housing justice was far from over. For Emily, the experience had been transformative. She stepped into a more prominent role within the advocacy community, using her platform to amplify the voices of those who had been silenced for too long. Her partnership with Councilwoman Ava Brooks blossomed into a lasting collaboration, resulting in additional reforms that tackled systemic inequality. Jack's transformation was equally profound. He began volunteering with a legal aid organization, offering his expertise to help tenants navigate the complexities of housing law. He and Emily found a renewed sense of purpose in their relationship, their shared commitment to making a difference strengthening their bond. One evening, as they sat on their balcony overlooking the city, Jack turned to Emily with a thoughtful expression. "Do you ever think about how far we've come?" he asked. Emily smiled, her gaze fixed on the twinkling lights below. "All the time. I'm proud of you," Jack said. "Of us." Emily reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "I'm proud of us too." Lila's life also took a turn for the better. With the stability of her new apartment and the financial support from the case, she was able to return to school and pursue her dream of becoming a social worker. Ethan thrived, his boundless energy and love of singing making him a favorite in his new school. One afternoon, as Emily visited them, Ethan performed an impromptu concert in their living room. His voice filled the small space, his joy infectious. Emily clapped along, her heart full as she watched the boy who had inspired her journey. The story of Lila, Ethan, and the Housing Justice Act became a symbol of what was possible when ordinary people stood up against injustice. Emily often thought back to the night she first heard Ethan sing on that street corner, his voice cutting through the noise of the city. It had been a simple moment, but it had changed everything. As she walked through Times Square one evening, the neon lights casting a kaleidoscope of colors around her, she paused at the spot where it all began. The city hummed with its usual chaos. But to Emily, it felt different now, less overwhelming, more full of possibility. She took a deep breath, letting the sounds and sights wash over her. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing: she was ready for it.